All right, I think we should start it. So, hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening in DC, wherever you may be joining us from today. My name is Sheldon Xie, a research fellow at the Center for Globalization Hong Kong, the CGHK. I'm thrilled to welcome you to today's CGHK Inside Dialogue entitled "Trump's Back: The U.S., China, and the World." First, I will use a 1 minute to introduce the CGHK. The CGHK is the leading and independent Hong Kong-based think tank that's committed to the policy research and the strategic consultation for both private enterprises and the government agency. We also serve as a vibrant public platform, foster the dialogue amongst the policymakers, scholars, and students worldwide on the critical global issues. So, to the surprise of many, President-elect Donald Trump has secured a significant victory in the recent presidential election in 2024, with the Republican Party gained the control of the both Senate and the House. So, with the President-elect Trump return to office, we anticipate a heightened economic and security competition, starting from the Biden administration between the U.S. and China, posing a increased risk to the bilateral relations. Predictably, I will argue that there will be more instability, unpredictability, and uncertainty in the U.S.-China relations in a couple of years, and it is more likely to see that the great nations' relations under the Trump 2.0 area might increasingly slip into a new Cold War. Maybe we will see. So the president-elect Trump's China policy in his second term, as well, we believe it will be more tougher, extremer, and more unpredictable and more confrontational from my perspective. So therefore, like the Trump 2.0 area will likely resume the tariff war. Seems like recalling back to the 2018 against China, and therefore seriously disrupting the trade and economic relations between the United States and China. If you can see the recent personnel of the Trump cabinet, as previously some guests, some of our panelists have discussed before the started, we have seen the Marco Rubio have been appointed as the Secretary of State. He's really a Chinese hawk there. So we can probably have some anticipation on what's the in the couple of years what the China policy will look like. But however, the complexity of these policies are underscored by significant financial influence like Elon Musk, so whose business interests in China, including the major revenue from Tesla sales and the supply chains, suggest a preference for a more measured approach to the U.S.-China relations. So amid this varied perspectives, including the isolationist within the Trump's own circle, who prefer a less hostile approach due to China's role as a major consumer of the U.S. agriculture and other energy products, the landscape is more more complex and multifaceted. So, in light of this dynamics, the CGHK has convened this dialogue to dive into this nuance of this involving U.S.-China relations under the Trump second terms. So, from our strategic vantage point in Hong Kong, we gathered a leading expert to bridge the understanding gaps and discussing the future of the U.S.-China relations during this critical moment. So I'm honored to introduce our esteemed panelists today. First, we have Mr. Douglas Pao, the Distinguished Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and also the former director at AIT. And we also have Mr. Neil Thomas, the fellow at the Center for China Analysts at Asia Society Policy Institute. From the Chinese side, we also have our distinguished Professor Jia Qingguo, who is the former dean at Peking University of School of International Studies and director of the Institute for Global Cooperation and Understanding. And we have Professor Da Wei, who is the director of the Center for International Security and Strategy at Tsinghua University. And guiding today's discussion, we have Dr. Peter Chiu, our chairman of the Center for Globalization Hong Kong, to moderating today's sessions. Together, we aim to unravel the complexities and seek insights and foster a robust discussion that shed a line of the way forward in the peace and stability to the Indo-Pacific and also the U.S.-China relations. Now, I will going to hand over to Peter to lead our discussion. Follow his brief remarks. Each panelist will have present their perspective in their opening remarks in 5 to 7 minutes, and then they will have a guided discussions among the panelists. So we will conclude the Q&A session with our audience before we wrap up. So Peter, the floor is yours, and then look forward to all your insights and your amazing discussion on this topic.
Okay, thank you, Shannon. Yeah, thank you, everyone. Last week, the last 8 days have been very turbulent. Yeah, nobody needs to be mentioned how tough it is going to be between the United States and the rest of the world, particularly in terms of the United States and China. Obviously, the U.S.-China complex will be facing to a more challenging period of time. Taiwan, national security, trade war, yeah, everything. And also, particularly in the last 3-4 days, what we have been seeing is a bunch of hawkish people have been appointed or at least considered, starting from trade representative, over the national security advisor, state secretary, a bunch of hawkish people. So let me ask each panelist to make about 2 or 3 or 4 minutes point, so-called representation from your point of view, whether you have expected and how do you see the complex is going to be, and then later on we'll have the discussion. Let me start with Mr. Pao, Douglas Pao in the US, and over Neil and Dawei and Qingguo. Okay, yeah. Mr. Pao.
Thank you, Peter Chiu, and thank you to my fellow panelists. I'm happy to see you virtually and to discuss these turbulent times. I'd like to make 2 basic points for the purpose of starting the discussion. One is that China focus, which is the topic we're discussing today, this has been sort of something moving American politics for quite a while. 15 years ago, Barack Obama tried to have a pivot to Asia, and yet he found himself getting embroiled in conflicts in the Middle East and never really succeeded in carrying out the pivot. And then when Biden came into office after Trump, he talked also about enhancing America's posture vis-a-vis China by aligning, investing, and competing. But that has also fallen afoul of the conflict in Ukraine and the last year's embroilment in Gaza and the Middle East again. So the U.S. has really not turned its full attention to competition with China over these 15 years. There's continuity. This is not such a big break to look at Trump attempting to carry these promises of previous presidents out in his second term. The second major point is a context. When presidents come in with strong mandates, they tend to have 2 years to do a lot of what they want to do. A lot of freedom for personnel appointments, a lot of initiatives. And Trump is no exception. Like Ronald Reagan, who came in and kind of ruffled feathers all over Washington in 1981, he came in with a lot of unknown figures to put into key positions, a lot of radical theories about how to change the way America was doing business, try to recover America from the post-Vietnam period. Fast forward to when Obama got elected, he had all the houses of the Congress and the presidency on his side, and he pushed through Obamacare and other controversial policies, which were quite expensive, and we're still reacting to that. And Biden, when he came in 4 years ago, he had, for the first 2 years, both houses of Congress supporting his agenda. And he came in with very big spending programs, some of which actually ended up undermining his position. His excessive spending with Congress on stimulating the American economy in the aftermath of the COVID epidemic ignited inflation, which is really what gave most of the energy to the Trump campaign to attack first Biden, then Harris, for not dealing with inflation. And American voters have largely voted on the grounds of economic unhappiness with the conduct of Biden's affairs, which were a result of the excessive power he enjoyed in the first 2 years in office. Now you fast forward to Trump's arrival 1 week after his election, and he too has the House, the Senate, and in fact the Supreme Court probably supporting him as he embarks. And so he feels free to name a large number of controversial figures, especially in foreign affairs. In a way, it's not controversial in that he's continuing the rebalance to Asia, or the pivot to Asia, pivot to China, that his two predecessors had undertaken, in which he had tried to continue in his first term in office. So there's a lot of continuity here, but it's threatened by the 2-year time limit on the next election of Congress. And the House will all be up for election, and the Senate, 1/3 of them members will be up for election again. And so what you're seeing now is just the seizure by the incoming president of the authority he has from the Congress and the electoral mandate in the presidential election to push through a, you could say, robust, even radical version of what he promised in the campaign. And that's where we find ourselves today. So far, we've had mostly foreign policy nominations. We haven't had the trade positions filled yet, and they may tell us more about some of the questions we'll discuss today. Certainly, a focus on China continues and intensifies at the 8-day mark of this new Trump administration. Thank you.
Thanks, Doug, and happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I'll just share a couple of thoughts to help get the discussion going on, firstly, Trump's priorities, and secondly, Trump's cabinet. On Trump's priorities, I think the most certain thing is that there's uncertainty about what exactly he will prioritize once he gets into the White House. When it comes to China, though, I think the most consistent position he's held for the past few decades of his life has been being opposed to the American trade deficit, wanting to bring manufacturing back to the United States, and a bit more recently, and especially during his first presidency, really embracing tariffs as the way, in his mind, to achieve these goals, as well as to gain leverage over other countries for negotiations. So I think we can be fairly certain that we'll see a pretty big and rapid hike in US tariffs, especially against China. He's promised 60%. He may not actually deliver 60% tariffs on all Chinese imports. These campaign promises have a habit of, being watered down and lobbied against before they become implemented. But I'd expect something. It's been such a big part of his campaign, such an easy thing for a president to do through executive powers, not having to go through Congress. And it'll be a quick win for something that Trump does genuinely believe in as well. So I think that's the most certain thing we can say about US-China relations going forward. The big question mark around that, though, of course, and there's a lot of uncertainty, that's the theme really of my initial remarks, is are these tariffs a part of a focus on China as part of a bigger American strategy, or are they part of a deal-making process that is going on in Trump's mind? So are they there for their own sake, basically, to advance the America First agenda, or are they going to be treated as leverage over China to extract some kind of broader, either economic or strategic grand bargain? Perhaps something in the mode of the Phase 1 trade agreement from the first Trump administration. Maybe there's a phase 2 trade agreement. Maybe there's something even bigger, something we can probably discuss later on, but that's another uncertainty. What's the purpose of these tariffs, which I think are going to happen for sure. And then secondly, looking at Trump's cabinet, I second everything that Doug said. I think, there's going to be a big question mark as to who has more influence over Trump on a day-to-day basis. Is it going to be the, national security China hawks that are in, state, Marco Rubio, National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, Pete Hegseth for defense, or are the more Wall Street, hedge fund, Silicon Valley types who could conceivably win appointment to head Treasury, perhaps even commerce? Are they going to have more influence on him? We see from the first Trump administration, there was a fierce battle between Robert Lighthizer, who may again be US Trade Representative, and Steve Mnuchin, his Treasury Secretary in the first term, about how far to go with tariffs and other economic measures against China versus how much to meet the demands of business for more open trade and investment support. So that dynamic could well play again in this second Trump administration. That's another big uncertainty about who's going to be more persuasive in the room with Trump, because that's really going to matter in terms of him being the key decision maker on China policy and kind of wanting to hear and play off different perspectives below him. And another just reminder in terms of the conversations we're having about these announced names for the big positions. These are nominees. They do still need to be confirmed by the Senate. The Republicans will have, I think, at most 53 of the 100 seats in the Senate. And as Doug mentioned, a third of those people will be up for re-election in 2 years' time. There are some Republicans who are in purplish states who might be under some kind of pressure if the next 2 years really don't go very well for the American economy. And so there's likely some people who may have that on their minds when the confirmation comes by. I mean, Trump is very powerful in the Republican Party, but he's not all powerful. And there's certainly some room for pushback on some of the more controversial picks. That's just something I think to remember as we have these conversations. And I will leave it there.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Neil. Okay, David, your turn.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Thank you, CGHK, for having me. I followed my two fellow panelists, American colleagues, very great perspective. I think I want to start from also 2 points. The first is how to view this election. I mean, as an observer, obviously, many observers believe that Trump could win the election before it, but I don't see many of us, foresaw the victory of the popular votes of the two houses, and also, a very strong, very clear, victory in all 7 swing states. I want to mention this because I think this is kind of mandate the American people gave Trump, no matter you like him or not. So I want to say this is a process actually started from the year, I will say, after the financial crisis in 2008. I think we are stepping into a period that we have to solve the problem, the challenges, the dark side of the hyper globalization period we had since early 1990s. So China and the US, we enjoyed a lot. We really loved that period of time because we have been such a natural match in that globalization period. So both countries benefit from that, from each other a lot. But that process, I think, caused a lot of problem, actually, not only in the United States or the Western country, but in China and other places. So what we have seen is actually not only a change of China-US relations, it's a change of the model of development. In every country, in the US, in China, we are readjusting our model of development. So the deterioration of China-US relations, I believe, is just a part of that process. And it's quite natural, though I don't like it. but I think it's quite natural. And the United States has not solved the controversy or the debate domestically, how to step out of that and how to set up a new model. So then China-US relations will continue to be a victim of this controversy and the debate. I think the victory of Trump is only the first, the newest development. The second point I want to say is the Trump 2025 probably will very different from Trump 2017. I mean, of course, Trump is still Trump, but I think many people are talking about Trump a deal maker, businessman, transactional president. Yeah, maybe he still want to do that kind of deal, but I have to point out that so far I don't know what is the goal of the deal if he want to make any deal. And I think his experience in the first term, particularly the year 2020 during the pandemic, changed his view towards China. I think he really believe it's because China he lost last campaign. And I think his team is also full of the so-called super hawks to China. So I think there is a very strong, feel of the retaliation, revenge in Trump and Trump's team. So that will add more fuel to the difficulty we will face next at least next 2 years. So I'm quite pessimistic about the China-US bilateral relations in the coming at least 2 years, because the bigger picture I mentioned, and also because the smaller picture that the Trump team and the Trump team will bring in the bilateral relations. So I think we need to be very careful, and particularly for Chinese side, I think we need to be very careful not to fall into the trap of tit for tat and vicious cycle. I think it's difficult to avoid that trap, but I think we have no other choice. I'll stop here. Thank you, Peter.
Okay, thank you, David. Chinko, please.
Well, thank you, Peter, and thank you, Sheldon. It's great to meet the panelists. My take is first, the election result is a surprise. I mean, especially the amount, the margin of Trump's win. I mean, all the polls were before that were quite misleading. It was not close. And why? At the beginning, you can't understand it, and then if you take a step back, you get to understand that it's. I mean, it's understandable. American people are not voting for a person, but vote for policies. Okay? Some of the policies of the Democrats on the economy, especially on identity, have gone to the extreme. And I mean, American people, the majority, cannot take it. For example, do you need to prioritize LGBT people in your employment? Do you need to pass a law to forbid? To forbid prosecution of the thieves or robbers under a certain value amount. I mean, all these things American people are fed up with. They voted for Donald Trump because Donald Trump argued that he can and he will change it. I think in the next few years, Donald Trump's focus would still be on domestic issues, how to restructure the government, change the policies, and also on immigration. China policy this is the background of the China policy. But the China policy, as Doug mentioned, has evolved over time. Now, I think both the Democrats and Republicans have reached a consensus on getting tough on China. Both perceive China as a threat from different perspectives. But of course, they also have different strategies as to how to deal with the China challenge. For the Democrats, the focus is on how to manage competition. Well, you have to compete with China, but then how to manage competition, not to let it to get into war by accident or military confrontation. For the Republicans, it seems to me that they want to win the competition, as suggested by an article by one of the top former top Trump advisors. So, but when you try to win a competition, the Republicans party's policy or Trump administration's policy on China may be even tougher on China, and also the way they treat China is different. They are going to focus. They're not going to focus on values, but they will play with values as a way to putting pressures on China, and they are going to raise tariffs. And they are going to decouple high tech. This is what they have promised to do, and also they may play with the Taiwan issue, whether you can bargain with over Taiwan or you change the policy of ambiguity, and these things have been very much in the floating among the Republicans. So the Trump administration's policy on China is going to is more likely to move to the tougher side, and also the China-US relationship is more likely to get into a rocky period, another rocky period. But of course, there are limits to where the relationship can go or where the Trump policy can go. First, we cannot fight a war. Both are nuclear powers, and we are not supposed to kill each other. So some kind of guardrail, no matter you like it or not, have to be built. And second, I don't think American business would allow anybody to take away their China market. They have dreamed about it for the last 250 years or 300 years. And finally, they have a piece of it. And now you take it away from them. I mean, this is against their interests. It is against American interests. And could bring a disaster for the rest of the world as well. So I mean, the Trump administration has to be very cautious on this. There are other limits. I'll not talk about it now, given the time. Let me stop here. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, obviously, from an academic point of view, the world is facing to a huge challenge. The phenomenon of which I called as a Trumpification is a problem. Yeah, which is reflecting the problem on the side of the United States, which is also reflecting global historical problem. Why so many autocrats, so many populist, leaders, all of a sudden coming to the power, all over the world, which reflects the the phenomenon of Trumpetification reflects a global historical problem, but which is from academic point of view, which I don't want to go to the details. So from this point of view, Donald Trump coming for the second time back to power obviously is a destroyer on one side, but is also a changer on the other side. Okay, but we want to focus more on strategic and tactical issues, dealing with the complex between the United States and China. We're not able to change the whole world. I expect some point from my point of view, 3 points in the last week in my podcast. I was saying, first of all, the second term of Donald Trump will be definitely not the same, at least not similar to the first term, which has been obviously to be on the way to be proven to be true. And secondly, a lot of people saying he's very unpredictable, but I was seeing maybe tactical. He was giving the people that he was unpredictable. But if we try to study his strategies from strategic point of view, Donald Trump has been always very consistent. He always realized his promise during the campaign, for the 4 years of his term. And thirdly, as Darwin mentioned before, or many times you mentioned before, I agree with you. I would say Donald Trump is more unpredictable than transactional. The idea of making deals with Donald Trump obviously might work, but if we don't focus on his strategies, what will be his final goals? So we will be very quickly sitting in some traps. Okay, that's 3 points which I was making in my podcast last week. Now let's try to speculate or try to focus on what could be the worst scenarios, what could be the best scenarios. That will be the up line and the bottom line for the US and China in the next 4 years. What will be the final goal, strategic goal of Donald Trump? What could be done? What could be done? What could be managed? In this context, upline, and the bottom line, so that they will be able, more or less, in a position to manage the conflict if we could still do in this way. So I would suggest let's go through some issues, based on this context, based on this framework. Let's go to different issues in the US-China complex: trade, Taiwan, tech war, de-risking policies, de-risking strategies, from Biden administration, whether it be changed, adjusted, or abandoned. If abandoned, to what extent? Allies between the United States and his allies, NATO, United Nations, European countries, Japan, which will be a sort of, I wouldn't say it's a hint, which would be sort of another, factor to consider what could be done between the United States and China. Okay, I will stop here. So I would suggest let's first pick up the Taiwan issues. Mr. Pao, you are long years expert for Taiwan issues. Well, the Taiwan issues radically changed, obviously, in the second term of Donald Trump? If yes, to what extent?
Well, we did see radical change at the end of the first Trump administration when then Secretary of State Pompeo threw out the old rule book for how Americans would interact with Taiwan. And then after he left office, he wrote a book calling for full normalization of U.S. relations between Washington and Taipei. But Trump has never seemed to share that kind of radical view on Taiwan. And for me, I tend to go back to what are his priorities. His priorities are domestic economic priorities. And a war over Taiwan would interfere with his attempt to lower inflation, lower taxes, promote growth, and promote revitalization of American industry. So falling short of war, there are many ways you can fall short of war, but not throwing out all the old rules, as Pompeo tried to do, probably is where they will start. And I don't see a lot of impetus within the Trump initial appointees to change that dramatically. Now, they will try to make Taiwan more part of the Asian defense perimeter surrounding China, but whether that would be something that would transgress the three communiques and other historic relations between the US and China over Taiwan is unclear to me. Trump, I think, he talks a lot about the deficit, but what he really wants tariffs to do is to be a substitute for taxes in the American economy so that he can release American energies. They did this in the first Trump administration by lowering taxes, and they thought that general growth would bring in new revenues and that would take care of the deficit that would result from lower taxes. That failed to happen. Trump ran up large deficits. Now he's reaching for tariffs, and tariffs would be the source of income that would make up the loss of revenues in a further round of tax reductions in this now second term of Trump administration. Getting China to pay enough to balance our trade deficit, getting the world to pay enough is, I think, less important to him than it is to provide some marketable position on income for the American people, to get them to think the tariffs will help to pay for the tax cuts he wants to pass, and probably will be able to pass with the two houses of Congress on his side. So far, the appointments that have been signaled by Trump are not people who want to radically change the Taiwan relationship. They do want to be tough on China. They do want Taiwan to do more for its own defense, but it's not a group of people who've been saying we have to attack the regime in Beijing, or success is the failure of the Communist Party of China. They seem to be willing to work within more realistic limits on what the US and China can do to avoid the kind of conflict that Chingguo was discussing, that I think we all share an interest in avoiding.
Okay. Okay, guys, do you agree with what Mr. Powell said? Obviously, in the previous administration, even including the first one of Donald Trump, Taiwan has been always on a focus, a focus between China and the United States. And now it looks like every war from Donald Trump's point of view is way too expensive. He looked at every conflict, every strategic issues only from economic point of view. If everything is going to be expensive, he just forget about it, no matter it's a war between Ukraine and Russia, or it's a focus on Taiwan. What he said is, if you guys, Taiwan, want the United States to protect you, you have to pay. But I do think some internal conflict between Donald Trump's personal idea on one side and his hawkish people will be sitting in his administration, starting from Mike Waltz and Mike Rubio. Will this guy also following the same logics as Donald Trump, saying if everything is going to be too expensive, let's forget about it? I don't think so. So I would rather expect some internal conflict coming up between Trump on one side and his team, particularly his national security team on the other side. I may be wrong. You can correct me. Dawei, Neil, and Qingguo.
Can I say something here? Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, I agree that I don't think the Trump, no matter President-elect Trump or his team is going to or determined to change the one China policy. I don't think so. And I am quite sure that President Trump does not want to fight a war over Taiwan with China. All those are very clear. My concern is, in next 2 or 3 years, let's say, I think the Trump's team will going to continue to build up the U.S. military presence in the region regarding Taiwan, and also help the Taiwan Authority to strengthen their military capability. That will, of course, make China very unhappy, and also will cause a danger of arms race, maybe. Then what I always worries me is the re-election campaign in Taiwan maybe 3 or 4 years later. So obviously, my theory is maybe what we have saw 20 years ago will repeat. I mean, a relatively weak leader in Taiwan will try to create some crisis in the strait to anger Beijing, to mobilize his supporter in the island. And 20 years ago, China and the US, I think we handled that quite effectively, successfully. But let's imagine 3 years later, when similar thing happened, what will a Trump team think? I think they will support. I think they will basically they will blame Beijing for all those changes, and will be have a more supportive position to Taiwan Authority. So that even though President Trump does not want to fight a war, I think that situation, that kind of crisis, I think nobody wants to fight a war, including Taiwan side. But I mean, these interactions could lead us to a real crisis. And then a crisis sometimes is really hard to control. Then at that time, maybe an internal fight that Peter you mentioned will happen in DC. Then President Trump and his team need to decide what they will do. But I have very serious concern over that. I think it's very dangerous.
I agree. Concerning Peter, go ahead if you want.
Okay, sure. No, it's your turn. Okay,
great. I agree with what previous panelists have said, and that it's certainly a concern and a risk factor. But I guess another side of looking at the Taiwanese domestic situation is that if there is any wavering of US support for Taiwan from Trump himself as president, I think there is a gap between his own level of caring about Taiwan and the level that his potential appointees in the national security space, want to move that relationship forward. But if that is seen to waver, then there may also be pressure on the DPP to reevaluate its policies towards the United States and potentially to be under pressure to explore some kind of dialogue with the mainland. Again, it's maybe not the most likely way, but it's certainly a possibility, because we're seeing in opinion polls coming out of Taiwan that in the last couple of years since Pelosi's visit, support for independence has decreased and support for maintaining the status quo has increased. So no one wants full unification, or very few people in Taiwan seem to want that. But the status quo is becoming more and more popular. So if the DPP moves away from that, then that could be something that is makes the DPP less willing to take risks in terms of trying to create a crisis. The other thing I'd say is that when it comes to the Taiwan Strait, we're, in my view, in a bit of a security dilemma situation where China is going through military modernization. China is conducting more and more military patrols with aircraft and ships around the Taiwan Strait and around the island. And while I know that Beijing frames these as exercises in deterrence, it doesn't want the United States to change the status quo in its view. But in Washington, D.C., the perception is that these are acts of aggression. This is something that is putting Taiwan's government under threat. So I feel it just highlights the importance of military to military dialogue, as well as more general dialogues and exchanges between the US and Chinese governments, as well as academics and civil society, to ensure that security dilemma dynamic doesn't spill over into accidental conflict or another type of security crisis.
In terms of DPP, you mentioned now, so what I read about is some DPP official has already expressed the view, okay, we'll be willing to pay. Let's talk. If you want us to pay, let's talk. So if the transaction is going to be in a naive way, very smooth way, only in terms of economic point of view, I think things will be easier. But I do think, as I mentioned before, I do see some internal conflicts, indications between his team, Mike Rubio's and Mike Waltz on one side, and Trump's personal ideas in terms of transaction on the other side. So, okay, let's see how things will be going on. So, but at least what China should be studying, and what we should be studying is whether Trump administration will be still willing to sell weapons to Taiwan. First of all, in a very tactical terms, and also secondly, from strategic point of view, will Trump administration will be still putting Taiwan as its focus in its East Asian policies, and particularly in terms of dealing with China. Qingguo, what's your take?
Yeah, I agree that the Trump administration would face two different views, or maybe even more views, on how to deal with the Taiwan issue. You have the more extreme views, and in terms of using national security as a way to push for tougher policy on China. And then you have the more economically oriented view, thinking that China is an important marketplace, and also we need to do both. One is to avoid a military conflict with China. The other is we should not give up the China market. So the former view would try to show up Taiwan by selling more weapons and maybe sending more military personnel to integrate Taiwan's military into the regional American defense architecture. And then on the other side, you see more efforts to persuade Beijing that U.S.-China policy, one China policy, has not changed. But no matter what, I think one thing can be can happen. It's more likely to happen. That is, the one China policy would be further eroded or undermined by efforts to improve and enhance relationship between Washington and Taipei. Official meetings between the two sides will be at higher level, and more weapons and more dual-use weapons. That is defense and offense. Offensive weapons will be sold to Taiwan, and also more military personnel would be sent to Taiwan. And so all this would create a situation in which the downgrading of official relations between China and Beijing and Washington becoming more likely. And also it's not quite inconceivable that we will see suspension of diplomatic relations if the U.S. side move too far on Taiwan from the Chinese perspective. So I think this is still a very dangerous place, and become more dangerous in the days to come. Thank you.
Okay, knowing that idea would be sounds very naive, but I still would like to put up pick up this naive idea, saying whether it would be still workable for China, as some Chinese pointed out, have imagined that China will be able to make deals with Donald Trump in transaction, in terms of Taiwan, if China will be willing to pay, saying over 200% tariff. Sounds very naive, but I know it's unrealistic, but let's try to rule out this possibility, or try to study whether to what extent it's workable. Guys, Dawei.
I think it's totally unworkable. I will say Taiwan is not something we can trade. No, maybe we can trade. When we have a crazy American leader, maybe he or she will say, hey, let's have a trade. I will stop supporting Taiwan, and you do something for me. I think that's I don't think that will happen, but I mean, that's something theoretically possible. But even if that happen, how can you govern? How can you govern the island? How can you solve the problem? How can you deal with your relation with 23 million people there in the island? I don't think that's something workable. I don't think we need to, uh, think it very seriously. Of course, yeah, maybe we can arrange something, try to lower the tension between China and the U.S. over Taiwan. That's something possible, but over Taiwan, no.
Mm, mm, mm. Okay.
I think it's important to say something about the people on Taiwan too. Um, Dawei has mentioned that a weak leader might look to get support for himself from the independence forces within the DPP. And I would think that's a realistic possibility in 2 or 3 years from now. Um, the leader in Taiwan faces the opposition in the majority in his legislative yuan, and he's unable to get things done. One area where trouble may arise is between Washington and Taipei, because Washington is trying to get Taiwan to do more, much as it's trying to get Germany and France and others in NATO to do more with respect to Russia. They want Taiwan to do more vis-a-vis China's military modernization. But the KMT majority, or the KMT combined majority in the Li Faoyuan, is not likely to be very accommodating to doing that, nor do the people in Taiwan generally seem to be interested in a beefing up of their military. This has been unpopular. One of the initial reactions out of the Taiwan public to Trump's election has been that they feel comfortable he'll take care of Taiwan, and Taiwan won't have to go to the expense of building up its military to 3, 4, 5% of GDP, getting serious about the draft, training, and the like. And so Taiwan may become a source of friction between the US and Taiwan, and a complicating factor in our trilateral Beijing, Taipei, Washington relationship.
I would just add as well that, I mean, Trump on the campaign trail has talked a lot about how much he respects Xi Jinping as a leader. He said like, I love Xi Jinping, really enjoyed, spending time with him. We're going to, meet up, we're going to do deals. And that's obviously, as Dawei has said, that doesn't mean that it's going to be easy or perhaps even possible to do any kind of deal, especially one that involves grand strategic issues like Taiwan. But I think the appetite for leader-to-leader diplomacy is still there under Trump. The Trump administration is going to look very different from the Biden administration. But I think the two presidents actually share that belief in getting in the room with their counterparts, not just in China, but across the world. So I think that is still one of the guardrails that will actually be maintained. It doesn't mean that Trump's not going to escalate all sorts of trade, technology, maybe even Taiwan policies, but there'll still be an appetite, I think, to get in the room, maybe even to visit China, which Biden didn't do, and maybe even to invite Xi Jinping to the United States as well. So I think that, that plank of US-China relations is still something that will be there. And if that goes well and there's a mood of cooperation coming from both sides, then there will be possibilities to negotiate along some of those lines of conflict and potential de-escalation of some of the economic things. Again, not from where we are now, but compared to, I think, the initial phase of the Trump administration, they'll be a big escalation. Trump could see that as leverage. And, in a best case scenario, that could lead to, intensive negotiations that, walk back some of that initial escalation.
Okay, this sounds very innovative, let me put it this way. But we still see a big hurdle on the way of being innovative, which is Marco Rubio as the forthcoming state secretary, who is still on the sanction list of Beijing. So what is actually, that's another naive question from my side. What is actually the consideration of Donald Trump, knowing that, of course, he's putting a bunch of hawkish people in his administration. He has his domestic concern. He has his strategic consideration. But from a technical point of view, he should be smart enough to know that Marco Rubio is still on the sanction list of Beijing. How can be nominate someone as top diplomat who is supposed to talk with Beijing? If he still wants to talk with Beijing, we're still on the sanction list. So technical, I don't see any workable place for Marco Rubio in talking with Beijing before a bilateral state visit will be workable, as you mentioned. So who can enlighten me? So what is actually Donald Trump's consideration in appointing Marco Rubio as forthcoming, or at least consider Marco Rubio to be a forthcoming state secretary?
I would say it's unlikely that China or Taiwan were high on the attributes of Marco Rubio when he was chosen for this job. The existence of a Chinese sanction against Rubio is probably going to get him a vote or two in the Senate for his confirmation. So that's probably something China ought to think about reconsidering, much as the U.S. has reconsidered its sanction on the Chinese defense minister so that they can continue to talk. By the way, one of the fruits of the last year of the Biden Xi summitry has been that military to military dialogue has been maintained at a low profile but substantively serious level, even in recent weeks. And I think that's something that both sides need to try to reinforce. The top level politics may get very stormy, but if you can keep the military to military communication going, we may avoid some of the eruptions that could occur when our forces are so close to one another in the Asia Pacific region.
Yeah, Trump's rewarding a lot of politicians and kind of members of the old Republican establishment, even including Marco Rubio, who have been loyal supporters of his re-election campaign this year. That's been a kind of unifying theme of all the people he's appointed. So yeah, I agree with Doug that it's unlikely that being sanctioned by China was the reason that Trump selected Rubio to be the Secretary of State. He might not have even remembered that had happened when he appointed him and put his name on it. Who knows? But I feel that, in the interests of US-China relations and bilateral diplomacy, I feel that it's certainly a impediment, but it's going to be up to Beijing to find ways around that impediment, perhaps through meetings in third countries. Jake Sullivan and Wang Yi obviously have been holding a lot of meetings in around the world. I think there was one in Vienna, there's one in Southeast Asia. So that could be an option, meeting on the sidelines of APEC, G20, ASEAN summits, those types of bodies. But ideally, there would be a way to ensure that they can meet in the US and in China.
Okay. Taiwan will be very, very interesting, very exciting for the US-China complex. Okay, trade issues between US-China. So before, let's remember 4 years ago, people used to hope that Joe Biden will be, reduce or if not abandon, but at least reduce the tariffs which Donald Trump used to impose towards China, but he didn't do. Instead of that, at the end of his term, even Joe Biden, even increased the high tariffs towards China. But now Donald Trump is coming back. So things will be rather escalation instead of de-escalation, that's for sure. But to what extent? To what extent? To what extent will trade war will be still a weapon in the hand of Donald Trump? And to what extent he's going to manage this weapon in dealing with China or in fighting against China? That way, Qin Guo.
Let me say a few words. First, I think there are two objectives on the part of Trump with regard to trade tariffs. I think he believes that trade tariffs helps American industry. It's like regarding the U.S. as a developing country, you need trade tariffs to protect your industries, and then you become competitive. And the second approach, the consideration is that trade tariffs can help reduce American government deficit. So you get money from trade tariffs to help reduce the government deficit. But the problem is, first, trade tariffs do not help increase American manufacturing efficiency, productivity. Second, trade tariffs are likely to lead to inflation, higher inflation. So eventually, I don't know. I think the policies that he's going to pursue is going to lead to further problems for him. And as far as trade tariffs to China, it talks about 60% on average trade tariffs, and I think that's going to create another round of inflation in the U.S. Okay, after some harsh measures, the U.S. inflation rate just got reduced to the current extent, and the Biden administration has suffered from that. And another round of trade tariffs against China, like 60%, would make inflation even more difficult to control. So I don't know whether eventually, but that's the background. Eventually, whether he would impose trade tariffs at that level remains a question mark, because his colleagues would or his subjects would try to persuade him not to go to the extreme. And ultimately, I think the Trump administration is going to be formed of royalists, or loyalists, and so the China policy is up to him. He can point his finger to this direction, others would follow, and he would point the finger to another direction, others would follow. So the individual preferences on the part of his cabinet may not be as significant or as important as they appear to be. So it's up to Trump. But Trump is a very transactional and unpredictable person in terms of policy. So here probably there is a big room for leadership, personal role. I mean, in terms of shaping the relationship. So if he and she can get along and strike some deal, then we can see the rest of the administration fall back to follow. So that gives us a glimpse of hope for the relationship.
Again, needs a precondition that the state secretary needs to be off from the second list of Beijing. But do you think that Beijing will put himself on a section list? I mean, macro view.
Well, I think anything is possible. I remember when the Chinese foreign defense minister, we had a problem.
I see.
We were in DC, in New York, having a meeting and raised this issue. Why can't the U.S. government lift the sanctions on him? I mean, he was sanctioned when he was in another post, and that post decided that he would be sanctioned. So now he's moving to another post, and also he's very important for building the guardrails. So why not lift the sanctions? The Americans were saying that once sanctions are imposed, it's very difficult to lift. But this is the case with the U.S. With China, I don't think it's that difficult problem. If we want to lift the sanction, we lift the sanction. It's up to whether we think that it's in our interest or not.
Okay, if you want to talk, people find a way. Yeah. Okay. I talk to many Chinese business people who have their business in the United States. They have so much concern about, what they told me is, okay, if Donald Trump still remains as a tariff of 10%, 25%, we can still increase the price and put the pressure to the supply of the United States and to the end consumer of the United States. But if you guys put the tariff to 50%, 60%, there's no business which could be done. And we need to withdraw from the US market. They're very much concerned. There's a very pessimistic mood around the Chinese businessmen who have their business in the US. Okay, let's talk about tech war. Let's forget about the trade war. Let's talk about tech war. Obviously, people used to be talking about decoupling, which has been obviously proven to be ineffective, unworkable at least. Then starting from 2 years ago, almost 2 years ago, Joe Biden administration has switched to de-risking policy towards China. Small yard, high fence. Okay, will that be still consistent? I do see some inherited tradition, inherited genes, let me put it this way, from Donald Trump. First turn to Joe Biden in terms of China policy, for example, in terms of trade war, no trade tariff has been abandoned, even reduced by Joe Biden. And now I do see some China policy consistency, let me put it this way, from Joe Biden administration to Trump administration. So in terms of tech war, will that policy be still consistent, or will that policy be changed or even radically changed, abandoned? I mean, if you guys remains as with a small yard high fence, that will be still workable. At least, as Dawei pointed out, still predictable. But if Trump is going to change in a radical way, then nothing could be expected. Nothing could be predicted. So, Dawei, what's your point?
I think first, I don't think there will be a fundamental change in regarding to the technical war. I think as you said, I totally agree. I think there is the consistency from different administration, from Trump first term, then to Biden, and then to Trump's second term. I think generally speaking, it will continue, and we may see even some worse development. Not about technology restriction, but I worry about the something like a China initiative, maybe come back, something similar to that. That will create more trouble in the technological relationship. Having said that, Trump is, though I don't think he is that kind of transactional president will do a transaction regarding the big strategic issue like Taiwan. But on the specific interest of some company, some technology, in some industry, certain specific industry, I think there is a possibility that Trump or his team may reconsider if they believe this is in the American industry or company's interest. I think that's possible. I think they are more flexible comparing with Biden administration on those specific issues. So my short answer is I don't think there will be a fundamental change of the policy, but on specific items, I think it's still possible. Maybe something good will happen. Yeah, I could be wrong.
Well, okay. To echo what Dawei just said, the Biden administration is in December supposed to issue the latest rules on technology controls, and I expect there will be a continued tightening of technology transfers announced as we merge from the Biden to the Trump administration, and I don't see the Trump administration reversing that. But as you've said, specifics matter, and Trump has spoken up on TikTok in particular as one company where he thinks maybe we've gone too far in expecting that TikTok should be taken out of our market. And he may come up with some compromise proposal for ownership or monitoring or rules of behavior of TikTok in the US market so that they can claim that it's still operating even if it's put under greater control.
Yeah, I think if you had to put money on one direction, tougher or softer on export controls and tech warfare, it's definitely going to be tougher, at least in the initial phase of the Trump presidency. So I think, there's a lot of people that will probably come into the administration who think that small yard, high fence is too weak. They want a big yard and a high fence. So could see pushes to expand export controls to new industries, maybe to biotech. It's been something else that's been put on the table, or various AI-related industries. There's going to be a conversation around that. But it also depends to some extent on who gets appointed to lead the Commerce Department, particularly to the Bureau of Industry and Standards, BIS, which has specific responsibility for these types of export controls. So that's a bit of a watch point going forward. And also, I mean, sanctions lists, right? The entity list is a tool that was highly favored under the first Trump administration. So I'd expect there's going to be a lot more Chinese companies that are going to find themselves on those lists or in danger of being added to those lists. So at least in the initial, 1 or 2 years, Trump gets in, there's this kind of wave of new appointees who want to, implement these policies they've been thinking about for the last 4 years when they've been out of government. I expect there's certainly going to be an escalation in that time period. And then it'll depend on US-China relations and diplomacy that both Doug and Dawei were talking about as to the direction things go from there.
Okay,
Yeah,
again,
okay.
Sure.
I agree that the Trump administration is going to be tougher on high-tech restrictions. And if you look at the Republican, senators and congressmen's comments on high-tech, restrictions, they always push for the toughest tougher policies, and so it's up to Trump to whether he would listen to his cabinet members. Most of his cabinet members are likely to push for tougher policies on high tech. But then there is but then of course we also have people like Musk. He is a high tech person, and he's very close to Trump, and so to what extent his views are going to have an influence on Trump or not, that's a question mark. And in the final analysis, American high-tech development, has a lot to do with the China market. Okay? For example, the computer chips. If the U.S. companies do not sell computer chips to the China market, they lose a lot. So and this undercuts its competitiveness in the long run, given a smaller market for them. So they would also fight to keep the high tech trade going because they believe that's in their interest and also in the U.S. long-term interest to engage in this kind of trade. Thanks.
Okay, the Musk factor sounds very interesting. Musk has his own interest in China, in Shanghai. His mom is living in Shanghai. Very interesting. Very interesting. Yeah. So what I read about is China has already started to put some influence toward his mom. I don't know, but anyhow. So remember what Donald Trump used to be do, 4 years ago when Huawei issue was just on the agenda. First of all, he wrote, going back then, it was still called Twitter. He published in his Twitter and appealing for the open competition with China in terms of high tech. And then he didn't say anything anymore. Obviously, he was persuaded by his team saying, hey, boss, don't mention we're going to have an open competition with China. But what I'm saying is, obviously, from his personal ideas, he was more in favor of having open competition with China. He's not so narrow-minded, but his team was very hawkish towards China. So this time will be so-called even more interesting. He has a very China hawkish team on one side, and might be his personal ideas on the other side. He has Elon Musk sitting in the middle with huge interest in China, who is a tech giant, who is also big entrepreneur. So to what extent was this game to be moving on, within his team and between him and Elon Musk? Let's try to speculate and following some internal logics and try to predict and draws a conclusion. Anything to say, guys? Or not?
My own view is that Trump has been elected largely by a population of people who've been losers in globalization, and the voters tend to be less educated than the Democratic voters, at least in the last couple of elections. Trump has to take care of those people, so he needs growth. I mean, getting the Department of Education to raise the education level of most American workers is not going to happen. It's going to have to be floating all the boats on a higher tide of economic growth. And the way you get that may be in part through Musk and the others, through deregulation, rewriting the tax code, promoting ways to fire up the American economy that will allow Trump to declare victory. That's not where they're headed. There seems to be a war in the administration between greater control and greater interference and those who want to have less control and less interference. And where that battle ends will make a big difference as to how the Republicans look at 2 years.
And we do know, just building on what Doug was saying, from Trump's first term, that he does pay attention to how the stock market is doing. He does pay attention to the economic data as well. That's something he cares about, and he wants to, be in a strong position. And that's, maybe one of the feedback mechanisms that might take a few months or a couple of years to really start showing pain if he does implement the full suite of tariff policies and other policies that he's got on his agenda. If that doesn't work out, that's maybe the time when he starts reconsidering some of those directions, and some kind of diplomacy becomes more possible.
Okay, maybe the last few questions in the last few minutes. First of all is United States and its allies. The first term of Donald Trump has proven that, he will destroy everything in terms of U.S. and allies. Will this time be the repetition, or will this term be different?
I think we discussed a lot about China-US relations, and my view is Trump is bad for US-China relations. But when we talk about US ally and all general US foreign policy, I see there are some opportunity maybe for China, I will say, but very limited. I have to say, of course, Trump's victory will raise concerns among the US alliances, no matter it's in East Asia or in Europe. But the structure is still there. China is in the East Asia, and Russia is in Europe. So this will not change. The geopolitics will not change. So I think the concern of the U.S. allies towards China and Russia will continue. So their need for U.S. presence will continue. Though they of course they feel less confident about the Trump administration, but I don't think that will fundamentally change the structure. But that will raise a lot of this questioning among the allies. So sometimes I always say 10 to 20%. I try to put it in that way. I believe that particularly if the Ukraine war solved, in next maybe 1 year, I don't know, in a way that maybe the Ukrainian people don't like. I think the U.S. Europe relation will deteriorate for 10 to 20%. And I think China-Europe relation will improve 10 to 20%. And I think U.S.-Russia relation will improve to 10 to 20%. And I think China-Russia relationship will be worse 10 to 20%. And all those 10 to 20%, I think, is in China's interest. This is my my answer to that.
Oh, okay. You said it in a very accurate way. Okay. Okay, Mr. Powell and Neil, do you agree? And Qingguo?
Well, I think we're going to have a very complicated period. Whether Trump is successful with Putin in working out something for Ukraine is a big question mark. We don't know, because Putin's ambitions and Trump's hopes, I think, don't come close to being near each other. Secondly, Europe is going through a phase where under Trump, there'll be a lot of pressure to spend more on defense. But the German and French governments, as the leaders in Europe, are both going into periods of weakness. So I think it's going to be a lot of thumb twirling in Europe for the next couple of years as they try to find a way of holding Trump's pressures off and not having, serious damage done to the alliance while they fail to measure up to Trump's expectations. Asia, I think we're going to see more of a responsiveness from Japan and Korea. And Southeast Asia, people have to ask themselves, how close do they want to be to China or the US? And they haven't really resolved that yet. So they'll be put under pressure to come to some conclusion. But I think it's going to be a very messy picture for the alliance structure, broadly speaking, as Trump tries to move them toward a larger share of contribution to their own defense.
Just add that there's been a lot of talk about how Trump's learned from his first term to do a better job in his second term. So the same thing's true actually for governments in allied and partner countries of the United States. At least the last couple of years since Trump got back in the race, there's been a lot of activity around planning for this possibility. And so I think that those governments are better prepared for managing a Trump administration too, and perhaps deciding to, make some moves in the directions towards, spending more money on defense. I think the Indo-Pacific, as Doug said, that's happening much more than in Europe, at least outside of Eastern Europe, which has been increasing that. So I think it will be more difficult, but the chances of, a total fracturing of the US network of allies is very, very low indeed. There's still a demand from a lot of those allied and partner countries for good relations with the US and to have a balance between the US and China. So that doesn't always mean that it's going to be a binary choice. No one wants to make that type of decision, not in China's favor and not in the United States' favor either. And so there'll be difficulties for those alliances, but I think they will survive quite easily, and in some cases maybe even thrive when we consider the Indo-Pacific.
I think sorry. Well, I think the U.S. allies would feel the pressure, and also there'll be more disagreements and conflicts between the U.S. and its allies. The U.S. would, this would happen on a whole range of issues, like on military spending. The Trump administration will continue to be very unhappy with the level of military spending on the part of its allies, despite the Ukraine war, and then this would put a lot of pressure. They would put a lot of pressure on the U.S. allies to increase defense spending, and then maybe there'll be there are bound to be some problems, and of course, Trump. Some people in the Trump camp call for the U.S. withdrawal from NATO. That also makes it, quite creates a lot of uncertainty. On trade, of course, you have 10%, the proposed 10% trade tariffs on all trading partners, and that also cause some frictions. And on environment, I think Trump is likely to withdraw from the Paris, the climate agreement. So, and there are many other issues. I think a Trump administration would think very differently from its allies. So this is a very interesting situation for China. Last time, China failed to take advantage of the situation and develop a better relationship with the U.S. allies. But this time, I don't know, maybe both the Trump administration and the Chinese government will think twice about what they are going to do. Maybe for the better of both countries.
Sounds very interesting. Yeah. Okay, withdrawal from UNESCO will be for sure because last time he already withdrew once from UNESCO and only Biden rejoined UNESCO. But the withdrawal from NATO and even from United Nations, as some people are talking about, would that be possible, imaginable? I mean, if Trump administration withdraw from NATO, it's going to be everything is going to be messy in Europe. Who's going to protect the nuclear, who is going to offer nuclear umbrella and so on. Is that imaginable, guys?
I mean, I think the way I think about it is that, you don't have to kill something for it to die, right? In the sense that you don't have to withdraw fully from NATO or, withdraw from the United Nations to significantly, weaken your contribution to it and to weaken the effectiveness of those bodies. There are certainly people in, Trump's circle that are very hostile to global governance. And he himself, he came up with the America First slogan. It's pretty clear what he means about that. And it's pretty clear that these types of multilateral institutions are a far less prominent part of his diplomacy, and indeed are often seen as getting in the way of that diplomacy than his predecessors in the presidency. So I think we will see a weakening of American commitment to global governance, and that will obviously have negative consequences for global governance, especially on climate, as was already mentioned. But they don't necessarily need to formally withdraw from these institutions to have that same desired effect from their point of view.
Okay, we have a question. We have some more question in terms of Hong Kong. Hong Kong. People tend to forget about Hong Kong, the role Hong Kong has been playing between the United States and China. It's a question directed to Neil. Say, could you share your thoughts on how the Trump administration's policy towards Hong Kong might evolve? Is there any possibility of new sanctions being introduced targeting Hong Kong-based institution, business, or individuals? What kind of potential impact might this have?
I also open the floor to my fellow panelists as well. I wouldn't claim to be an expert on Hong Kong specifically, but in terms of the conversation around Hong Kong in Washington, it's certainly a lot less prominent than it was a few years ago when the protest movement, the national security law were really dominating the news. Hong Kong's certainly an issue that many China hawks like Marco Rubio care about, but whether it's going to rise to the level of priority where we see lots of new sanctions on Hong Kong, that's a much bigger question mark for me. It's certainly possible. Like I wouldn't rule it out, depending on developments in Hong Kong, depending on the plans that someone like Rubio is bringing in to the State Department. But it's certainly a watch point. That's how I'd phrase it at this point in time. I haven't heard a lot about it in the discussions in DC, but we know it's something that these people coming into administration do care about. And if they had been in government or had been able to make policy during 2019, 2020, 2021, rather than Trump himself, they'd have probably gone a lot harder. But again, will Trump support these sanctions? That's, again, something I don't have a great deal of insight on at this point in time.
Okay, and it takes from other panelists.
I think for all intents and purposes in Washington, Hong Kong has become just another Chinese city. Mm-hmm. And so people don't think about it as really different from Shanghai or Guangdong or other places.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's bad. Okay, Dawei and Qingguo, any takes?
Dawei.
Yeah, I think Hong Kong still need time, but I'm still confident to the future of Hong Kong. At least, I'm physically in Hong Kong right now. I mean, Hong Kong is still a city that you drive on the left of the road, so it's still different. Yeah, and also I think there are a lot of talents. And I think the law system here, the rule of law is very good, and many English-speaking people here. So I think but I think it needs time to recover. I hope Hong Kong can preserve its. We say one country, two systems. So I hope Hong Kong, after solving the one country problem. I hope the city can preserve its two-system part. That will be the key of the success of Hong Kong in the future. But I'm a little bit pessimistic for next 4 years for Hong Kong because it's still too short. But I still believe Hong Kong will come back. This is a different place. I need a passport to, not a passport, but a special ID to Hong Kong. So this is a different place from China. Yeah.
Okay, Qingguo, any point?
Well, I think Trump administration's policy toward Hong Kong will be different from the Biden administration's policy in the sense that the Biden administration's policy attaches a lot of importance to values, whereas a Trump administration's policy probably would focus on security and economic interests. So probably it's likely that there will be some policy shifts, despite the fact that both are going to put pressures on over Hong Kong on the Chinese government. But I'm still trying to figure out, what kind of policy changes specifically the Trump administration would come up with.
Okay, in this framework, also in this sense, we're slowly touching the end point. So what could be the worst scenarios in the next 4 years, Trump administration, and what could be the best one to apply? So within this framework, maybe to what extent we can be in a position to manage the conflict. And also in this regard, let's don't forget about what Donald Trump used to do almost 4 years ago, a little bit more than 4 years ago, in July 2020, he suddenly closed down, the U.S. consulate, the Chinese consulate in Houston. So which caused all of a sudden huge surprise, huge shock, for the U.S.-China already existing complex. So people have been talking about whether it will be the next target for Trump to close down. China's Chinese consulate in the U.S. and whether it will be, as some hawkish people used to say, cut off ties with China, including economic ties, diplomatic ties. And also there's one rumor spreading around that maybe Trump administration is going to close down the U.S. consulate in Hong Kong, since Hong Kong has been anyhow viewed as a normal Chinese city, as Mr. Paul, you mentioned before. So why don't we close down? Okay, anyway, this remains as still existing rumors, but let's don't forget about what happens in July 4 years ago, in the case of closing down the Chinese consulate in Houston, then all of a sudden Chinese retaliated and closed down the U.S. consulate in Chengdu, right? And none of the consulate has been reopened. So this remains as a closing question. What could be the worst scenario? What could be the best scenario? What could be done? So I will ask each panelist maybe to run up with 1 minute or 1.5 minutes presentation, starting with Mr. Powell.
Well, I think and the worst scenario is what was discussed earlier by the panel, which is that the U.S. and China downgrade relations because of something that happens with Taiwan. And that could be have a variety of sources, whether it's Taiwan domestic politics or a collision between American and Chinese aircraft or ships again, and say near the Taiwan Strait. That would be, I think, at the bad end of the spectrum. The positive end of the spectrum, I don't move it very far towards optimistic. I think if we can avoid retreating as far as we now look like we're going to retreat, that might be the most optimistic outcome I can envision.
Okay, Neil?
I don't know if it's the worst case scenario necessarily, but something that I'd be really worried about over the next 4 years, given that bilateral relations are, I think, more likely to get worse before they get better, is if there was some kind of accidental, military encounter, accidental kind of skirmish, either in the Taiwan Strait or the South China Sea or some other piece of territory where you have Chinese and US forces present, I'd be worried about the escalation spiral there at a period of time when the relations between the two governments are likely to be, less embedded than they are even now, and maybe less, have much less diplomacy predisposed in those people who are running the position. So I'd be worried about the escalation spiral of an accidental military encounter, a kind of Cuban Missile Crisis scenario as well, like any kind of bilateral crisis. Basically, I feel like we wouldn't necessarily be in a particularly good place to manage it. The upside, though, and potentially a reason why that wouldn't happen would be that, I think there is still room for leader-to-leader diplomacy, and to some extent, the system below the leaders would follow if that happens. And I personally think, as a kind of suggestion in that vein, I think the United States should show some strength and be prepared to reopen its, Fulbright and Peace Corps programs with China. I think, a confident country is one that is, happy to send its people out all over the world and, meet new people, share their experiences, get to know something about the world, share their own worldview as well. And I think that's some low-hanging fruit that, a confident Trump administration should seriously consider, because I think it's in the US national interest, and it would have the side effect of, I think, introducing some more ballast for ensuring that US-China relations don't veer off into the potential for conflict going forward.
Okay, Dawei, what's your worst one and the best one?
Yeah, I think the bilateral relations in the coming years will become, I call it US-Russia plus. I think it will become more like US-Russia relations. I mean, the two sides view each other as maybe an enemy, adversary, or at least, and then we may see downgrade of the diplomatic relationship. We may see decrease of the trade and economic ties. We may see a dramatic decrease of the people-to-people tie, including Chinese students in the US. So I think those, and it's not the worst. I think the worst scenario is plus that. I mean, I said US-Russia plus, and the plus is we may have military conflict. I think Dog and Neil, both of them mentioned that possibility, though not very high, but it's possible particularly because the U.S. U.S. have the commitment to, for example, to the Philippines, and the U.S. have a very vague commitment to Taiwan. U.S. does not have a commitment to Ukraine. Ukraine is not a NATO member, so that's the worst scenario. So new Cold War or even a hot war. The best scenario is maybe after 2 or 3 years of very difficult interaction, maybe the two sides will realize that we learned a lesson from the reality. We think that we have to stabilize the bilateral relations. So for me, my expectation is not high at all. I think after 2 or 3 years, maybe we will see the bilateral relations stabilized again. If that could happen within the term of Trump in next 4 years, I will think that's good. For me, it's already good enough.
Okay, before I ask Qingguo to make your final points, I suddenly realize there's a final very interesting question in terms of people-to-people link and exchange, people-to-people link between the United States and China, particularly in terms of students' education exchange, because that's also concerned quite a lot of people in China. Yeah, so which has proven to be very, very bad in the first Trump administration. Yeah, so maybe Qingguo, you can combine this final question along with your final points, since also you're a professor at Beijing University.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Well, I agree with most of the panelists have been saying. I think the worst scenario is, well, whether the best scenario, worst scenario has to do with the Trump leadership. Now we have a leader who has a lot of power and who knows how to mobilize power to get things done in the U.S., including overriding opposition. So we have finally the U.S. is having a leader that can dictate, and what that means for China-U.S. relations. I think first, the worst scenario is we have decoupling, economic, political, people to people, high tech. We move into a process
Coupling. Okay, let me
of rapid decoupling.
Yeah, let me follow this question. Decoupling in which sense? In cut off diplomatic ties, or in closing down some consulate, or in cut off more economic ties?
They are all part of it. We're talking about decoupling the two countries and two societies. That's the worst scenario. And of course, in the process, you can have all kinds of things can happen, including accidental wars. The best scenario, that's a possibility. I mean, if Trump, China-U.S. relationship is counterproductive to their own interests, the current level, the state. Okay, the two countries actually are stakeholders. They have a lot of shared interests and stakes. Okay, so whether they cooperate or, of course, they also have a lot of conflicts. So whether they cooperate or manage or confront with each other, you can always find a basis for that. Good argument. So if Trump subscribes to the argument that China-U.S. relationship, China-U.S. have a lot of shared interests and stakes, and it's in both countries' interests to leverage the other country's resources to help maintain the international order, to serve their own interests. If he managed to subscribe to this view, China would have a good counterpart to deal with. Okay. Then we can find out some solution to manage our differences and also to promote our shared interests and stakes. It's very unlikely at the moment, but it remains a possibility. Okay. But under the Trump administration, if the previous situation the scenario that I mentioned prevail, then the best situation is that we managed to, after a series of conflicts, we realize how dangerous it can be, and then we managed to stabilize the relationship by building some guardrails for the relationship that may be different from the current guardrails that Biden has been trying to build.
Okay, thank you very much, guys. It has been a very interesting, discussion. Now 8 days after Donald Trump won the election, we still have let me calculate. We still have 2 months and 6 days, right? 66 days ahead of us until he'll be taking office on the 20th of January. A lot of things could be still happening. A lot of things are still underway. So let's observe what will be underway, and let's try to catch up everything and try to make something out of it. This discussion has been the first one organized by CGHK, and let's hope we have more opportunities to get together to study out more things. Thank you very much. Now Sheldon will be run up.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Peter, and thank you all the panelists. And Ernie, thank you to all our colleagues, friends, scholars, reporters, and even students who have joined us today. Your active participations in this crucial conversation holds immense value as we collectively navigate this pivotal moments in the post-US elections and forecast some policies under the upcoming Trump's the second term. So if you have any questions, concern, or share interest in collaborations or among the institutions, I encourage you to explore our CGHK account. And don't hesitate to reach out to me, Sheldon Xie at cghk.com. So if you have any input or engagement, we will continue to willing to have a deep understanding and collaboration at this uncertain time. And I look forward to the upcoming weeks or month when Trump is in Trump's inauguration at January 20th. We will have some more opportunities to have this panel like this and having the insightful dialogues with our colleagues from the United States and China. So have a good day and have a good rest of your day in the US, or have a good even have a good morning for those who in China. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Well,
Thank you.
yeah,
everyone.
next time.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.